Okay, so we're going to introduce a new theme this week, looking at the role of political institutions and how those can shape foreign policy outcomes. And so there's a couple different pieces to this that we'll talk about, but a lot of it goes back to this idea of democracies behaving different in terms of foreign policy than authoritarian regimes. And this is something that's been well studied and has resulted in this idea of a democratic peace. And so I want to just kind of introduce this idea of a democratic peace from the perspective of an empirical phenomenon, that when we've studied patterns of conflict looking at democracies versus authoritarian regimes, it appears to be, it is empirically, we've observed this, that no two democracies have ever gone to war with each other, ever. And it's as close to an empirical law as we have in any of the social sciences. There's been studies that have suggested that the findings for democratic peace are perhaps multiple times stronger than the findings linking cigarette smoking to cancer. So again, the numbers look really good, and yet social scientists are still not completely persuaded by those numbers and what they really mean, and if the democratic peace is a real thing, something about democracies really is changing the behavior of countries, or if there's some other kind of explanation that's going on. So folks who would maybe point to the idea that democracies do indeed behave differently than authoritarian regimes will point to not just the democratic peace pattern, that no two democracies have ever fought a war with each other, but they'll point to other things that seem to be different. And so one of those differences is that democracies seem more likely to win the wars that they fight than non-democracies. So something about democratic institutions or democratic societies makes countries more willing to fight longer, or fight harder, or commit more resources, or fight differently in a way that helps them to win. Or maybe they're just selecting conflicts to fight in more judiciously. And this tends to hold for both conventional conflicts, so traditional wars between armies, and non-conventional wars, or guerrilla wars or insurgencies. And that kind of runs counter to the conventional wisdom that democracies don't do very well when fighting insurgencies, when in fact there's sort of a selection thing going on, that democracies tend to be much more stable. And so they tend to not have guerrilla movements and insurgencies sort of rising up to overthrow them internally. And so when we see democracies fighting insurgencies, they tend to be fighting foreign wars. So the US operation in Afghanistan for 2 decades would be an example of fighting a certain insurgency on someone else's territory. And that's really hard. Nobody does that well, democracies or authoritarian regimes, but it happens to be that democracies do better than authoritarian regimes when fighting those kind of insurgencies. And even when facing internal insurgencies, democracies tend to do better than authoritarian regimes. We've also observed that democracies build their militaries in different kinds of ways. So democracies tend to build more capital-intensive militaries, more machines and tanks and bombs and armor than non-democracies. Non-democracies tend to have more labor-intensive militaries. So militaries where you have large numbers of soldiers in uniform, but maybe those soldiers aren't as well equipped or as well supported. And I think that maybe makes sense, the idea of democracies maybe being both wealthier and having a maybe sensitivity to casualties and public opinion pressure that maybe isn't present in authoritarian regimes. And then lastly, we found that democracies tend to form alliances, particularly in times of war, with other democracies. So we've just got a variety of different mechanisms that seem to sort of reinforce this idea that democracies do indeed behave differently in their foreign policies than authoritarian regimes. But when we return back to the data that undergirds that sort of empirical law of international relations, that democracies don't fight each other, there's some qualifications. And so one of those qualifications is that we're not saying democracies are just more peaceful. That's certainly not the case. In fact, the data does not support that at all. Democracies are just as likely to get into war as authoritarian regimes. It's just that when democracies do get into war, they don't fight those wars with other democracies. So not more peaceful, just more peaceful with other democracies. It also looks like democracies may be even more war prone against non-democracies than non-democracies are against non-democracies. Another way of saying this is that when democracies do pick fights and do fight wars, those wars are always with non-democracies, whereas authoritarian regimes will fight with other authoritarian regimes and with democracies. And if you were an authoritarian regime, you'd much rather have a bunch of other authoritarian regimes on your border than a bunch of democracies. And we can maybe talk about why that is. I think partly it's just a mathematical, corollary to the fact that democracies are not more war or less war prone than authoritarian regimes, and they choose their adversaries. Maybe there's something more to it. Maybe that non-democracies are understood by democracies as being bad, or that there's some sort of moral high ground argument that gets deployed by democracies that allows them to fight more frequently against authoritarian regimes than they might otherwise. I have no particular evidence to back that up other than there is this pattern. Another couple qualifications I would throw in. When we talk about democracy, we're talking about mature democracies. I don't know exactly what that means. It could be defined a variety of different ways. It could be defined as your leadership grew up in a world where all they knew for a political system was democracy, and so maybe 60 years, so that the generals in the military would never even imagine launching a coup. Maybe you need a two-turnover rule where the party in power loses an election, gives up power, and then the opposition sort of loses an election and the party that was originally in power returns. Maybe that signifies that democracy is mature. In practice, political scientists have just sort of picked a 10-year sort of threshold and said any democracy that has made it past 10 years is now a mature democracy. They've sort of got through the rocky transition phase. I don't know if that's a particularly good threshold, although I will say that the first 10 years tend to be pretty volatile for democracies. Young democracies below that 10-year threshold actually tend to be the most war-prone states of any states in the international system, more war-prone than authoritarian states, more war-prone than mature democracies. Although, when we've dug into that finding, that young democracies tend to be erratic, that they tend to attack their neighbors or are attacked by their neighbors, most of it seems to boil down to that sort of post-World War I environment where a number of multi-ethnic, multinational empires have been torn apart, replaced with sort of young, nascent democracies that had pointed disagreements about where the borders have been drawn. That seems to not be the case as much anymore when we see new democracies. They're much more likely to have internal conflicts than sort of widespread dissatisfaction with the state of the borders. I would also flag that 10-year threshold is really important, that from the perspective of preserving democratic peace, there was a war in 1999 between India and Pakistan, the Kashmir conflict, in which Pakistan was like 9 years and 8 months old as a democracy. And so that was really close from the perspective of democratic peace. Additional qualifications when we're talking about democratic peace, we are talking just about war prevalence. We're not saying that democracies are nice to each other. That's not the argument. Democracies will use covert operations against each other. They will spy on each other. Occasionally, they will even overthrow governments, like the United States did in Guatemala under the Eisenhower administration, overthrowing a democratically elected government using covert operations. And defenders of the democratic peace would say, yeah, the US did that because fighting an open war against another democracy would just be viewed as unacceptable. The Eisenhower administration opted to work with opposition groups and foster a armed overthrow because anything more overt would have run against the mechanisms that make democratic peace function. Democracies spy on each other, they criticize each other, they engage in what sometimes is called soft balancing. So a number of European countries have noticed that the United States is in a largely dominant position in the international system and have said more or less, that's fine, but we would like the United States to sort of remain somewhat checked in its use of power, and so have used the United Nations and other alliances to sort of restrain or limit the United States' sort of freedom to do whatever it wants in the international system. And that's totally consistent with democratic peace. We're really just talking about war. And while we're talking about war, I should flag one more little caveat on that, and that political scientists tend to operationalize war. We measure it oftentimes with a threshold of 1,000 battle deaths. That's sort of the historical definition that the Correlates of War Project has used. And so border skirmishes in which democracies are shooting at each other don't count unless they reach that 1,000 battle deaths in a given year threshold. So there's a lot of caveats and limitations, and political scientists will point to a lot of those as reasons why maybe this democratic peace finding isn't quite as strong or robust as some of the headline numbers suggest.